Ops basically came about from a desire to write about the bomber war after my father died in 2007. I wanted to meet men who had shared the same experience as him, which he'd often told me about. He was an Australian who'd served as a Lancaster bomber pilot in 460 Squadron at Brayton, Yorkshire, in the early part of 1943. After 6 months instructing at an operational training unit, he returned for a second tour only to go missing on his first operation. Fortunately, he survived this and went to Stalag 3 prison camp in Silesia for a year. But his was not such an unusual experience. In fact, most aircrews suffered similar but slightly differing exploits. In view of this, it was obvious to me that I was going to have to meet other veterans firsthand, and so I set about interviewing around 20 or so former aircrew and recording what they told me about their experiences. Gradually, I began to understand the chronology of the bomber war. It was basically divided into 6 periods. That is, the early period, which included some minor raids against North German ports, leading up to the first 1,000 bomber raids at the end of May 1942. This led to the Battle of the Ruhr, i.e. the concerted attacks against Essen and surrounding cities in the Ruhr Valley, which also included a number of attacks on the U-boat pens on the French Atlantic coast and in North Germany. This was basically intended as a precursor to what Harris termed his main offensive, the attack on Berlin. In the summer of 1943, the 4 firestorm raids against the old Hanseatic port of Hamburg occurred, which were generally more destructive than anything Harris could have predicted, and were followed by a one-off operation against the V-Weapon Production Centre at Peenemünde. From then on, following the success at Hamburg, Harris was able to turn his attention to his cherished main offensive against Berlin. This consisted of 16 major raids which had varying degrees of success, up until the final 2 operations ending with the disastrous Nuremberg raid, which had such high losses that the campaign had to be called off. One of the other more strategic reasons for this termination was that, beginning in April 1944, Harris came under the authority of the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, who wanted his force to attack the French transportation system in order to interrupt the German communication before D-Day. This Bomber Command successfully did. Concurrent with this, and his contemporary General Spaatz of the 8th Air Force, in Operation Point Blank were required to get the German Air Force up and destroy it before D-Day, which they largely did. This led up to the final major raids of the war, when a force of 1,000 bombers was quite common, and included the Thunderclap operations on Chemnitz, Leipzig, Dresden and also Berlin, intended to ease the pressure on the Eastern Front. Of the 19 veterans I was fortunate enough to interview, 3 had been on Pathfinder squadrons, which was an elite force. Bill Higgs was on the first 1,000 bomb raid against Cologne with 35 Squadron at Gravely, and later did some training operations as Leonard Cheshin's flight engineer. David Lincoln, also on 35 squadrons, but over a year later, was a navigator shot down on his first operation. Dick Raymond, a flight engineer on 83 Squadron at Whiting, took part in a number of raids on Berlin, but had the misfortune of nearly being killed when a 12,000-pound bomb exploded on his dispersal pad before they took off. Of those interviewed, Harry Sparks was a wireless operator with 207 Squadron at Langer, Lincolnshire, who was wounded in mid-air during a Cat's Eye night fighter attack, and was on the crew of the BBC reporter Winfred Vaughan-Thomas, who flew to Berlin with him on the 3rd of September 1943 to make a live broadcast. Henry Coverley was a pilot on Cheshire and James Tate's 76 Squadron and was shot down on the infamous Nuremberg raid of the 30th of March 1944, when 97 bombers were lost in one night, more aircraft than fighter command lost during the whole of the Battle of Britain. Ted Borman was a flight engineer with 102 Squadron at Pocklington in Yorkshire and fell 18,000 feet before his parachute opened, giving him 10 seconds before he hit the ground. Joe Williams was a rear gunner with 625 Squadron and was shot down in March 1945 during one of the Thunderclap operations against Chemnitz, only to discover that his parachute had been burnt to a frazzle. You'd have to read the book to find out whether he survived or not. Howard Pierce was shot down in 1942 when a navigator on Wellington's with 115 Squadron and was on the escape list for the Great Escape of April 1944. Arthur Cole was also on the escape list for the Great Escape and was a bomb aimer on Halifax's with 158 Squadron at Lisset from mid-May until the end of August 1943, when he was shot down on a raid during the early stages of the Battle of Berlin. He had the unnerving experience of once being involved in a head-on collision with another bomber over the target area. His first crew were broken up after he had a flaming row in the crew room with his Irish navigator, who was very offensive, and Cole was posted to another crew. The book also examines the infamous Luftwaffe interrogation centre near Frankfurt, Dulag Luft, when all captured aircrew were sent for interrogation, almost all of which spent at least one day in solitary confinement prior to interrogation, sometimes considerably more. Both Pierce and Coverley told of the heating in their cells being turned up to an almost unbearable level. For my father, this was his second period of solitary, as he had already spent 21 days in the SS prison at Fresnes, Paris, where many SOE agents were incarcerated. The work also examines morale, or more specifically, lack of moral fibre, and how it affected crews, a barrier that even the lowest airmen feared. This was at a time when there were no counsellings for battle fatigue and the term post-traumatic stress didn't exist. The chapter examines LMF and the causes and effects of it. It is impossible to go into too much detail and talk of this length. Suffice to say that I tried to cover the subject of Bomber Command's war in the air as comprehensively as possible, which wasn't easy in view of the lateness of the hour. However, rather than examining technical aspects of the technology to the nth degree, I was more interested in finding out what motivated men and how they cope with the stresses and worries that they, an entirely volunteer force with the entirety of the war, had to endure on operations.